All right. So just reminder everyone of the format real quick. We're just going to do a quick presentation here. Just kind of going over everything that was in the reading for this week, which was just chapters 1 and chapters 2. It was pretty light reading for the most part. It was like 20, 25 pages. We're doing 2 chapters each week. So the next week we're going to be going over chapters 3 and 4, and that's going to be Bankshot that's going to be presenting those. So yeah, we're going to have the presentation here, and then we're going to have time afterwards for just like discussion, questions, whatever you guys want more information on. If you guys want to touch on some more topics, just anything, doesn't really matter too much. All right, so chapters 1 and 2 here. So the first chapter here, what Murphy talks about, is chapter 1 is what is economics, right? So this is kind of an interesting question just from the outset, because if you think about it, in most other fields and most other studies and sciences and things like that, you don't spend much time talking about what that field of study is exactly. So let's take biology, for instance. If you open up a biology textbook, there isn't going to be a lot of space devoted to the questions like, what is biology? Like, generally, there's just going to be like one sentence at the very beginning of page 1 of the textbook. Biology is the study of living organisms. That's pretty much it. That's pretty authoritative. There's really not much more to say than that. That's what biology is. You could say the same thing, for physics. Maybe you could say the same thing for history. History is the study of the past. I mean, it might be kind of broad, but broadly speaking, that's correct. History is the study of the past. But economics is kind of different, because economics is not exactly so clear what it is that we're studying, right? And we kind of need to do this examination of economics because it is kind of an open question of what economics is precisely. Because if we have a vague view of economics, if we don't understand it properly, then we're not going to really have the correct method and scope and the correct mindset going into this. We need to make sure that we have a very clear understanding of what this science is in order for us to be able to actually do anything productive within the science itself. So as Murphy shows in the text, there's no shortage at all for definitions that have been offered for economics. I mean, if you open up an economics textbook, almost every textbook is going to have their own slightly different definition of economics. Like one of the ones that Murphy talks about in here is from Stephen Levitt, who's one of the authors of Freakonomics, if you guys have read that book. And he quotes him saying, "Economics is above all a science of measurement. It comprises an extraordinarily powerful and flexible set of tools that can reliably assess a thicket of information to determine the effect of any one factor or even the whole effect, so on and so forth." If you ask somebody on the street what their definition of economics is, just like a layman, they might say, well, economics is about money, or it's about supply and demand or something like that. And that's broadly speaking correct. I mean, economics does talk about money. That does talk about supply and demand, obviously. I mean, there's lots of different things like that. We can say, okay, yeah, economics does study those things. I mean, it does study things like capital and labor and land. Like, those are all things we talk about in economics, but it doesn't quite seem like that's what economics is. Like, even some better definitions of economics, you might say, okay, economics is the study of scarcity, or something like that. Okay, well, economics is obviously concerned with scarcity, because if there was no scarcity, then there would be no economics. There would be no point to any of this, because there would be nothing for us to economize. We'd have as much of everything as we want, right? But even then, it's like, well, economics does study scarcity, but it's a little bit more than that. There's something else that we're missing here. But one thing that we can know for sure, one thing that kind of unites all these various definitions together, is that economics concerns itself with human behavior. No matter what else we're going to say about economics, every other definition you might be able to offer in some way ties back to this one fact that we're talking about humans. We're talking about things that they do. We're talking about human behavior specifically when we're talking about economics. Now, that definition is very broad still, okay? I mean, that's, history is about human behavior, right? Because of human behavior in the past. So that doesn't really limit our field of study very much. There's still lots of things we could be talking about. We're talking about human behavior. It's not necessarily just economics. I mean, history fits in that, like I just said. You can talk about sociology in terms of human behavior. I mean, you can even talk about some philosophy in terms of human behavior, right? There's lots of things that comprise human behavior, but economics is in that broad tent at some point. And that gives us a start, that we have to understand this human behavior, this larger tent of human behavior, before we're going to really understand economics. Now, the specific term that we use for this study of human behavior, of this study of human action, is praxeology. And that's a bit of a fancy word, but really all that it means is it's the study of action. It's the study of what human beings do and what it means to act. Now, the later study that we're going to be doing, that's going to be economics proper, or the study of the market, is catalactics. And these two words, praxeology and catalactics, are the terms that Ludwig von Mises uses in human action, which is the terminology that Murphy is adopting here. Praxeology, the study of human action, and then catalactics, which is the study of the market. Both of these being essential for us to understand economics proper. praxeology for us to understand the broader tint of human behavior, but then catalactics to understand more of the bits and pieces of economics proper. All right, so that's chapter 1. Now the next here is chapter 2, which is where we're going to talk about praxeology. We're going to be talking about that bigger tint of human behavior. Now, even just saying that humans act, there's lots of things that we can kind of draw out of that. There's lots of conclusions that we can already draw just from that one statement, which is kind of remarkable in and of itself. That just from the one fact that humans act, there's lots of things that we could already know about human behavior. But the first thing that we need to know is that whenever we're talking about action, we have a very specific definition in mind. We're not just talking about anything that humans do. We're just talking about purposeful behavior. Whenever we say that someone is acting, we're saying that they're aiming at accomplishing an end of some kind. Whenever they're doing some sort of activity with a specific goal in mind, there's something that they want to accomplish. They're not just kind of moseying about for no reason, just kind of doing whatever. Whenever we're talking about action, we're talking about purposeful behavior. It actually means something. They have an end that they're aiming at. It's being done for a reason. Now, whenever we use this definition of action, it excludes any sort of involuntary movement and reflexes or anything like that. Essentially, what we're doing is we're separating out human activity from human action. Now, human activity would include like involuntary movement. Now, one example that I like to use is, like breathing, for instance. Now, breathing is something that can be done voluntarily. Like, sometimes people will remind you that, oh, you're breathing right now. You're consciously doing that. You're welcome for everybody out there listening. That, oh, you're breathing right now. That's something that you're doing voluntarily. However, breathing is also most of the time something that we just do involuntarily. It's not something that we're actually conscious of. It's just something that the unconscious part of our brain takes over. It just happens automatically. So breathing, can be an action in some ways if you're purposefully doing it, if you're actually thinking about breathing, right? But most of the time, it's just this involuntary thing that happens. It's not action because you're not thinking about doing it. You're not purposefully breathing in any sense. You're not breathing for the sake of accomplishing an end, even though, of course, breathing does accomplish things for you, keeps you alive, but you're not thinking about that. Right. So another example might be, whenever you're getting a checkup at the doctor hits your knee with that little hammer, the little plastic hammer he uses, and your reflex is that your knee kind of kicks up. Right. Well, that you're not thinking about that. You're not doing it purposefully. It's just an automatic reflex. It's just a reaction. Right. So whenever we're talking about action, whenever we're talking about purposeful behavior that's aimed at achieving something, we're not talking about that. We're not talking about these involuntary movements and things like that. Not any involuntary behavior. Now, one thing that we should point out is that action does not necessarily involve any bodily activity. You don't have to move your body at all to be acting. Now, if you think about action as purposeful behavior, this might seem a little strange at first. You're thinking, okay, how could it be that you could do something purposefully, that you could behave in a certain way, but you wouldn't be moving at all? Well, and the reason is that action does not necessarily involve movement. All it involves is that you're doing something purposefully. You're doing something and achieving an end. So you can think about meditation, for instance. I mean, the entire goal of meditation is for you to try to empty yourself as much as possible. You're trying to do as much nothing as possible, but that involves you just sitting there on the floor, maybe in some like meditative stance, but you're not actually moving in any sense, right? I mean, there's some forms of meditation that involve movement, but most of them you're just kind of sitting there. But that is still action because you're purposefully doing something. You're trying to empty yourself as much as possible. That's the goal of meditation. That's the end you're trying to achieve with your action. However, you're doing nothing. It's just completely as much like silence, as little movement as you can possibly do. That's the entire goal. But that's still action, even though you're just sitting there and you're doing nothing. It's still acting because you're doing something purposefully, even though the thing you're doing is itself just trying to be as still as possible. Right? So action does not necessarily involve you moving around, any sort of movement or activity or anything like that. You can be doing nothing at all, but you could still be acting. What matters is that you're doing something purposefully. You're doing it for the sake of achieving something. All right, so from just these few simple facts, we can already draw out some conclusions about what it means for someone to act. Now, the first one that's kind of obvious is that for there to be action, there must be an actor. For someone to do something purposefully, there obviously must be someone there who is thinking about doing it purposefully, right? I mean, this is the I think, therefore I am. This is just a very basic axiom of philosophy. We can apply it here to economics as well. For someone to do something, there obviously must be a person there. I mean, that's just common sense, right? It's self-evident. Now, the second one is that for someone to act, they must have preferences, right? So this one is a little less clear, but it's still definitely there. You just have to draw it out a little bit more. So if someone is acting, if someone is doing something purposefully, well, you must ask, why is it that they're doing that particular thing? Right? Whenever whenever we're faced with a prospect of action, whenever there's something that we could be doing, well, there's obviously costs to that. There's always things that we could be doing that we're not doing right now. So like right now, I'm here giving this presentation, giving this lecture to all of you here on Discord, but there's lots of other things that I could be doing. I could be watching TV, I could be reading a book, I could be sleeping right now. There's lots of other things that I could be doing. So for me to actually have this preference, or for me to try to achieve this end here of me, which is giving this presentation, that's what I'm doing right now. What we have to assume is that there's some sort of preferences there, that I have a reason for doing the thing that I'm doing right now, which is giving this presentation. So I have these preferences. There's things that I want to do. There's things that I value more highly than other things. And I'm acting on those things right now for the sake of achieving those ends. So we have to have these preferences in order for us to act. Because if we valued everything equally, then we wouldn't act at all, because we would have no reason to act in any particular direction. Because if I valued all those things that I said equally, giving this presentation or watching TV or reading or sleeping, if I valued them all equally, I wouldn't really have any reason to do any one particular thing. In order for me to act, that is demonstrating that I value doing one of those things over doing the others. And the third thing here is that for someone to act, they have to have some sort of understanding of cause and effect. So for me to try to achieve a goal, I have to have some sort of understanding of the ways that I can achieve that goal. I have to have some sort of understanding of the means that I could use to achieve that end, right? So which means, in order for me to understand that I employ these means for the attainment of ends, I have to understand cause and effect in some degree, right? Because the means is the cause for the effect of the ends, if that makes sense. So in order for me to have this means end framework, for me to try to achieve anything at all, I have to understand cause and effect. In other words, it doesn't really make any sense for me to try to achieve an end if I don't understand how I could cause particular things in order to achieve particular effects that I desire. It doesn't really make any sense. So those are the three things that we can kind of draw out of this idea that people act, that there must be an actor, that people have preferences when they act, and that people must have understandings of cause and effect. And those are the three things that Murphy kind of brings out in this chapter here. There's going to be more of those different conclusions that we can draw out of the concept of action, which are going to come up in chapters 3 and 4. But those are the ones that are in chapter 2 here, and more of that's going to be coming in the next chapters as well.
All right. Let us begin our covering of chapters 3 to 4 of Choice. The third chapter was about economic theory and historical understanding. First, we gotta understand what a priori and a posteriori actually are, because these are very important terms in economics and in this book. A priori knowledge is just knowledge that we know without observation. It's when we know without doing any sort of empirical observing. Usually, this is obtained through introspection, but that's besides the point. A posteriori knowledge is knowledge that we gain through observing something. Like if we see a blue square at a window, that's a posteriori knowledge. We know that because we observed it with our eyes, our senses. We observed it. An example of a priori knowledge is something like 1 + 1 = 2, because we can deduce that without observing any two objects together. Now, what we gain from this is an understanding that economics is deductive and not inductive. In this sense, economics is a priori. This is what Mises claimed here. He claimed all economics laws should be deduced from axioms. Now, this also means that economic laws cannot be falsified or disproved by any historical empirical evidence, because it is arrived at deductively, and we know that it is true because of deductive reasons. So no amount of empirical evidence can disprove an economic law. And Murphy uses the example of the Pythagorean theorem. No one's going to go around measuring right triangles to prove the Pythagorean theorem. And we can't even imagine a world where a logically deduced concept could become false. Like, you can't imagine a right triangle in the Euclidean space that violates the Pythagorean theorem. It just simply is not possible. Now, deduction does not mean no observation either. This is a very important point to emphasize, because you can still observe things, but you just can't disprove things that are deducted with that observation. And this is the key point that Mises stresses. The end goal of economics is to know reality in the end. It's to get as close to reality as possible and to find cause and find cause and effects. Things like empirical axioms or empirical observations can help aid that. An observation could obviously help aid deductive processes, because if you're stuck in a closet your entire life, you probably won't arrive at the law of diminishing marginal utility, because you have no experience in anything. Now, this is where chapter 4 comes in. Chapter 4 is the implications of all this. Now, first, a very important concept of economics: what is a good? Like a good. To understand this, we have to understand what a good is first. A good is something that's inside your mind. It's not something physical. Like you can't just say gold is. Like you can't take all physical gold and say that's good because a good varies from person to person. Like gold and gold in your telephone are obviously two different things to the average mind, even though they're the same physical composition. Consumers, and there are multiple classes of goods within this. Consumers' goods are goods that directly satisfy wants or ends. Like if my end goal is entertainment, and I got a laptop and I started playing games, that would be a consumer's good because I'm using it to directly fulfill my wants of entertainment. Producers' goods are goods which indirectly lead to satisfaction of wants by bringing about a consumer's good. So like something like steel to make a bicycle for transportation, that would be a producer's good because you're using it to produce a consumer's good, the bicycle. And then you can separate producer's goods into different tiers. You have first order goods onwards, so first order, second order, etc. And each of these is just a stage above the other. So if steel is directly used to make a bicycle, and the bicycle directly fulfills the want, then steel is the first order good because it's the closest to the consumer's good. What's used to make that steel is then the second order good because it's used to make the first order producer's good, and etc. Now this is where we get into empirical assumptions. Empirical assumptions are just things we get through observation and things that we also take to be true. So one of these is that the utility of labor. And there are two main ones that Austrians make. This is one of them. The utility of labor simply states that labor has this utility. The more you do labor, the less you like it. Like if you work 1 hour, you're gonna not like it that much. But then if you keep working, it's gonna usually exponentially decrease in value. So you're gonna want to do less and less labor. The reason this is more of an empirical assumption is probably because empirical assumptions, you can imagine a world where empirical assumptions are false, right? Like we can imagine a world where people work all the time and they don't never stop and wants to rest. That would violate the spirit of labor, but obviously that's not very realistic. This is contrast to the fact that we can't imagine a world that where deductively deduced economic laws are false. Another important empirical assumption is that leisure is a consumer's good. This simply states that people treat leisure as a consumer's good. So now, this is the first major deduction usually made in the Austrian books. It's the law of diminishing marginal utility. Now, this spawned mainly from the question: why are diamonds valued higher than water? You know, water is key to life. Why do people prefer diamonds, something that's more of a luxury good? Why do they prefer to water? And the answer to this is that people have a lot more access to water than they do to diamonds. You know, and that's because people value things based on the amount of goods they have of that thing right now than the entire stock. Like obviously, when people value their possessions, they don't value it based on how much of that there is in the world. They value it based on how much they have at their disposal. And the way Murphy deduces this, the example he uses is the example of someone going camping and bringing water bottles. Now, if you buy 4 water bottles and you have 4 ends that correspond to those water bottles. Say your highest valued end is your own thirst. You want to quench your own thirst. That's the highest priority. The second highest valued end is water for your dog because you want to quench the dog's thirst. Then the third is backup water for you, and the fourth is backup water for your dog. Now, this is in a tier, so this is ordinal, which means that it's descending in importance to the person. So the first one's the most important, the second one's less important than the first one, etc. And now, if you had 4 water bottles, you would allocate them in a way that represents that importance. So the first one will go to quenching your own thirst. The second one will go to quenching your dog's thirst, and then etc. down your value scale of ends. Now, let's say your dog knocks over some water. Say dog spills some water, and you only have 3 bottles now instead of 4. Now you can't fulfill one of those 4 ends. So you would take away the water bottle from the least valued end and put it to the higher valued end. Now, another important deduction is the law of diminishing returns. The law of diminishing returns simply states that the more of a factor you put in, factors can get diminishing returns in terms of making products. So there are 3 main factors. You have land, capital, and labor. You need a combination of these things to make anything. You need labor and like natural resources to make anything basically. And you can only add so much of each factor before you get like non-existent returns. So say if you had a farm and on the farm and you have 50 acres of land, 3 workers and a tractor. The tractor is your capital, the 50 acres is your land, and the 3 workers are your labor. If you added a bunch of, like, say, 100 workers, that would probably boost the productivity of your farm, but you would get massively diminishing returns if you do so, because each worker can only start contributing more when the other one's left off, right? Because there's a maximum limit set with what you can do about based on the land and capital. And this applies to every single factor. The more capital you add, the more diminishing returns exist too. This is basically all you cover in the chapter.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started, I suppose. So the chapters for this week are chapters 5 and 6, and these are kind of interesting chapters because chapters 3 and 4 are a little bit more focused on the praxeology and the methodology of economics. And chapters 5 and 6 here are a little bit more interested in the bigger picture. So we kind of zoomed in a little bit for chapters 3 and 4. We're zooming a little bit back out for chapters 5 and 6 to have a little bit more of a foundation moving forward into the actual economics, which is what we're going to be starting in the upcoming chapters. So chapter 5 here is on human society and the division of labor. So the first thing that we have to recognize, something coming from Mises, is that human society most fundamentally is widespread cooperation. Like, more than anything else, that's what it is. Because if you have strong relationships with your family, with your friends, with people like that, that's nice, and that's enough to maybe make your own small community. But in order for you to have a society, that involves interactions with people you don't necessarily know, with people that you're not intimately familiar with, right? And the way that this sort of cooperation takes place is through the division of labor, specifically. Now, the division of labor is a term that most people are kind of familiar with. Essentially what it means is just that instead of everyone doing everything all by themselves, people specialize in different things. They do individual tasks as opposed to an entire production process. Maybe they do an individual task in that process. And everybody cooperates together to allow that production process to totally go forward, for the entire process to happen, right? And the idea is that at the end of the day, this is going to be more productive for everybody else, because whenever people can specialize, whenever labor is divided between multiple people are going to be ultimately more productive, and there's a lot more stuff that's going to get done. So the entire reason why human society arises in the first place is because of this recognition. This is something that Mises really drills home in Human Action, is that human society isn't really just the product of people just wanting to be in community with each other, even though that is something that people want to do. But most fundamentally where it comes from is this idea that whenever people interact with each other, whenever there's this division of labor and they're cooperating, people are significantly more productive, as opposed to whenever they're just involved in individual or very small scale sort of autarkic production. Right? This is where human society comes from. It's not just feeling good about each other and wanting to be around a whole bunch of people, but it's the fact that because I'm living in a society with other people under this division of labor, as opposed to just kind of living on an island by myself, like, Tom Hanks in Castaway or something like that. Being around these other people improves my own life as well, just my material happiness, if for no other reason. So this kind of poses the question, well, why exactly does the division of labor make society more productive? And I'm glad you asked, because there's a lot of reasons that Murphy lists as to why division of labor makes labor in particular more productive. So the first one that he lists, and maybe one of the most intuitive, is just there's less time wasted switching between different tasks. So for example, if I'm living on my own island and I gotta build my own shelter, I gotta wash my own clothes, I gotta catch my own food, I gotta do everything by myself, I'm gonna be spending a lot of time just walking to and fro around my island doing various things, right? I'm gonna have to constantly be switching between different tasks in order to accomplish all these things by myself. Whereas you can imagine that if I was living on an island with a few other people, and each one of us had a specific job, or one person's building the shelter, and one person's washing the clothes, another person is collecting water, another person is building fire, so on and so forth. You can imagine all these different tasks and everything. If everyone is just assigned to doing one of those things, there's no time wasted switching between all these different tasks and trying to move from one place to another, right? Everybody just focuses on their one thing, and because of that, a lot more gets done. The next one is that it promotes automation. Now, automation sometimes gets a little bit of a bad rap within the broader social consciousness on the idea that automation takes away jobs and things like that. Well, in reality, automation is something that's very, very useful, right? I mean, if we didn't have any form of automation at all, we would still be living in the Stone Age. Automation is something that improves our quality of life because it's one other thing that we don't have to devote time, we don't have to devote labor towards. And division of labor promotes automation specifically in the fact that whenever we have this division of labor, we have this idea of individual jobs and tasks that need to be done. So as opposed to me having to make some sort of automated, clothes cleaning device, maybe I could automate certain parts of the way that, we clean clothes or things like that. So like, in one sense it might be like, how we have like a washing and a drying machine, something like that, right? If we didn't have a division of labor where there's these tasks like, cleaning and drying clothes, then you would never even think about trying to automate this, right? To be able to make it more productive and be able to save you a whole lot of time. Another one is economies of scale. Now, the entire concept of economies of scale is that as something gets bigger, it inherently gets more productive, right? So you might think of, okay, having a very, very big factory building, for instance, a very big warehouse, is much more efficient than having a bunch of little tiny warehouses all kind of clumped together, and you have to keep running back between different warehouses in order to get stuff done. If you just have one really big warehouse, you have this idea of this economy of scale where it's just much more productive because it's just much bigger, right? And division of labor can kind of help promote these economies of scale because, if I'm going to be involved in a production process and I think, okay, it'd be much better if I had an entire factory for me to be able to do this thing, this giant warehouse, as opposed to just doing it in my own little hut on an island here. Well, if I'm just working by myself, there's really no feasible way for me to do that, right? I'm never going to be able to build this giant factory on my island. Whereas if I'm living in a society with other people and we have this business, you might say, okay, well, if we have this new factory, we're going to be much more productive, so we can all kind of work together in order to get this done. And that everybody can be working on their own various jobs in order to be able to build this factory, right? Because it's going to be significantly more productive in the long run. So it promotes economies of scale. That's another thing. Another way the division of labor is more productive is that certain tasks require certain quantities of workers. So, for example, there's certain production processes, like you might imagine building a car, which is just not feasible for you to do by yourself, to be able to gather together all the different materials, to be able to perform all the different labor tasks that need to be done in order for you to build a new Tesla. That's not going to be something you are going to be able to do by yourself, right? There's a certain amount of people that are going to need to work together in order to make that happen, in order to be able to build that car. And without a division of labor, there's no way that's going to be able to happen. Just with autarkic production, where you're just living on your island by yourself, you're never going to be able to build a Tesla. Whereas if you're living in a society where the division of labor is present, it's possible that you could have multiple people working together, each person specializing in different things in order to be able to build this car. One of the other more intuitive ways the division of labor is more productive than just individual production is just natural skill and ability. So some people have natural skills and abilities of doing particular things. So, if you have somebody who's just a really, really good welder, it makes sense for everybody to go to him to do all of their welding that they need to have done, right? Because he's just particularly good at it. If they want some welding done, you go to this guy because he's really good at it, right? Well, under the division of labor, you could have everybody that has that thing that they're good at. Because you can imagine, going back to our previous example of everyone living on the island, right? And there's this division of labor. Well, everybody has their own thing that they're particularly good at. So you have the person who's really good at hunting down and killing animals to use for food. You have the person who's really good at construction, building your houses and everything. You have the person that's really good at building fires, to build your fires in order to provide heat. You have all these different people doing individual things. And because they're just particularly good at those things, it's just more productive, more stuff gets done. And everybody's happier in the long run. Another one is acquired skill or ability. So just as some people might be naturally good at things, if you spend a lot of time working on one individual task or one individual part of a production process, you're going to get much better at it over time. And I think anybody who's ever worked in a job can attest to this fact, right? The first day you're on the job, you're probably not all that useful. You're not necessarily knowing what you're doing all that much. But as the days and the weeks and the months go on and you acquire much more experience, eventually you're much better at that job than you were whenever you first started, right? You've acquired lots of skills and abilities because you're just doing that one task over and over and over again, whatever it is, whether we're working in a business or something like that. You just get better at it over time because you have more experience. So that's the acquired skill and ability of being in the division of labor. So this next example we have here has to do with a law of association. And this is the last reason why the division of labor is more productive. Now, whenever we think about the division of labor, we generally think about it under terms of comparative advantage. And this here is kind of a little bit of a numerical example to show how comparative advantage works, because this is generally how we think about things. So we have person A and we have person B. These are two people that are living on an island, let's say. And then we have good X and good Y. These are the two different goods that they can produce. You can throw whatever you want to in your mind. You could do apples and oranges or whatever, but we'll just call them good X and good Y for now. So person A here, if he specializes and he just does one thing, he can produce 10 units of X or 5 units of Y. But if he tries to do both of them at one time, if he tries to move back between different tasks and accomplish both of them, he can do 5 units of x and 3 units of y. Now person B here, if he specializes in just one task, he can either do 5 units of x or 10 units of y. And if he tries to do both of them, then he does 3 units of x and he can produce 5 units of y. So in this example here, it's pretty obvious that person A is better at producing x than he is at producing y, and person B is much better at producing y than he is at producing x. So right here we can see a pretty obvious example where it behooves them to try to exchange with each other, right? Where person A is going to focus exclusively on producing x, that's the only thing he's going to do, and person B is going to focus exclusively on producing y. And we can kind of see this through the isolation outcomes and things like that. So you see the isolation outcome, if person A and person B decided to both do their tasks by themselves and they're not going to specialize, they're going to try to do 5 units of x and 3 units of y, and then person B does 3 units of x and 5 units of y, the total outcome there, the total amount that is produced is 8x and 8y. If you combine the 5x and the 3x and the 3y and the 5y, that's what you get. You get 8x and 8y. Whereas if they cooperate, if person A just produces x and person B just produces y, what we end up with is the total production is 10x and 10y. You can also summarize this with just the total amount of units that are produced. So the total production, if both of these people are isolated and they're trying to do everything by themselves, is they're going to produce a total of 16 units, which is just the combination of 8x and 8y together, right? That's the total production. Whereas if they cooperate, then they're going to get 10x and 10y if they specialize and trade with each other, right? So if they isolate, they're going to end up with less of what they want. They're going to end up with less total production, and they're much less happy overall. Whereas if they specialize and they cooperate, then they're going to end up with much more, because they're going to end up with the 10x and the 10y and the total of the 20 units, right? So this is an example of comparative advantage, where each person has an advantage in something compared to the other person, where person A here has the advantage in producing x as compared to person B, which has the advantage in producing y. That's comparative advantage. However, there's another interesting question we could ask from this, is what if instead of one person being better at producing one thing than another person, the other person's better at producing something else, vice versa? What if instead one person is better at producing everything than the other person? Does it still make sense for them to trade in that scenario? And this is the law of association, because it's a little bit counterintuitive, which is why I want to try to go through this step by step. But even in such a scenario, one person has what we would call an absolute advantage. They don't have just a comparative advantage, but an absolute advantage. They're better at producing everything than another person. It still benefits both of them to actually specialize and trade with one another. And we're going to go through that here. So let's look at person A and person B. So person A can produce, if they specialize, they can produce 100 units of X, or they can produce 80 units of Y. And if he tries to do both of them by himself, he tries to produce both, then he could do 75 units of X and 40 units of Y. Now person B over here, they can only produce, if they specialize, 10 units of X or 15 units of Y. But if they try to do both, then they could do 8 units of X and 10 units of Y. So we can see in this example that person A is much better at producing both X and Y than person B is, right? Because, regardless of whether or not they specialize or if they try to do both, in any case, he's going to be much, much more productive than person B is, right? However, we can still see that person A is better at producing one thing than he is at another, right? He's better at producing X than he is at producing Y. And simultaneously, even though person B is producing much, much less than person A, we can still see that he's much better at producing Y than he is at producing X. Right? So if we go down to the isolation and cooperation outcomes, we can see that the total amount of production, if both of these people remain isolated and they don't trade with each other, is 83x and 40y, which is just a combination of the 75 units of x and then the 8 units of x from person B, and then the 40 units of y from person A, and the 10 units from person B. Right? It's 43, and that should be 50 actually. Excuse me, that should be 50y. That's a typo there. But 83x and 50y. Whereas the cooperation outcome, if they specialize, if person A specializes in what he's good at, he ends up with 100x, and then person B, if he specializes, ends up with 15y. Total cooperation there is 100x and 15y. So if we move down, we can actually see that even though person A is much better at producing everything than person B, if they specialize in what they're best at, we end up with more total production. Because we can see that in isolation, the total amount of production units is going to be 115. It should be 115, not 103. Or 113, excuse me, not 103. That's a typo there. But it should be 113 units. Whereas if they cooperate together and they work together and they specialize, total production is 115 units. So we can see that even though person A is better at producing everything than person B, total production and the total amount of goods they have to consume and trade amongst each other is still at its highest whenever each person specializes in what they're good at and still engages in a division of labor. So that's a law of association, is that even in the extreme example where one person is way better at producing everything than another person, it still benefits both of them to specialize in what they're best at and then trade with one another. That's the law of association. So that even in this extreme case, we can still see that the division of labor benefits all participants. So that's chapter 5 about society and the division of labor. But chapter 6 here is about reason and the role of ideas. Now, this might seem like a little bit of a weird place to be able to put this chapter. It might seem like it should have gone a little bit beforehand, maybe back in like chapter 2 or 3 before we started talking about praxeology. But I think this placement, it actually makes a lot of sense, because we just got finished talking about the division of labor in society and how all this arises. Well, the division of labor in society arises because of an idea, specifically the idea that people are more productive whenever they engage with each other. And it was because of that idea that society itself arose in the first place. So we can say that a very simple statement, but people are motivated and driven by ideas, right? I mean, that sounds really obvious. Like, yeah, of course people have ideas and they're motivated by that. Like, that seems like almost just nonsensical, so common sense, not even worth saying. But what that means, if we accept that, which I assume everybody that's listening would accept that, is that those ideas then are going to be dictating the actions that people take. And the actions that people take are going to be motivating the entire fate of a society at large, right? Because it was the actions that individual people took that resulted in the division of labor, the recognition of the division of labor as being more productive, and thus as the society that we know it today as being existing in the first place. If it wouldn't have been for that recognition, if it wouldn't have been for that idea, then we wouldn't have ever had society at all. And I really like this quote from Keynes. You won't hear me say that a lot, but I do like this quote from Keynes where he says, "Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist." It's funny because oftentimes it is true. These ideas, especially in economics, for instance, these ideas that people have that motivate the views and the ways that they view society have very profound implications on the way that society operates, the way that it runs itself, and things like that. Like the idea of the division of labor is something that's very basic, but the entire idea of market exchange, for instance, that's another idea that people have had, right? And if people reject that idea, well, then maybe market exchange can, maybe be a thing of the past. Maybe we can, move beyond that. That's at least what people think, right? So this idea that the people are motivated and driven by ideas, it goes through everything, even all the way back to the division of labor. Like I just said, that cooperation inherent in society makes people more productive. So we can kind of trace out this role of ideas, and we can even extrapolate that out further into like this conflict of ideas, right? This idea that as certain people have ideas and other people have others, that these ideas kind of clash with each other a little bit. And something that Murphy does in the book is he kind of traces out a little bit the way that some of these ideas have actually clashed with each other, to be able to kind of illustrate a little bit further how these ideological battles can play out. So the first one that he kind of mentions is the Marxists, right? And one specific aspect of Marxism, which is the dialectical materialism. Now, that's a big word, and we can't really get into all of Marxism. But essentially, it's this Marxist idea that the underlying fate and structure of a society isn't necessarily composed by the people's beliefs that they have, or any such like voluntary ideas that they hold or anything like that. But rather, the structure of society is determined by the actual material processes of production, like the factors of production that exist. So in Marx's view, it wasn't the fact that the Industrial Revolution came along, that the steam engine became so prominent. Really, it was the fact that the steam engine was invented and became so prominent that brought along capitalism. That's the Marxist idea, which stands completely in contrast to the Austrian, and specifically the Misesian idea that people hold ideas. These ideas are not just the product of the material factors of production around them. They're just the stuff, the capital that exists. Rather, these ideas are really the product of themselves, of what they believe about society, right? So that's the kind of the Marxist view versus like an Austrian view on where the entire structure of society comes from. Now, another one of these ideological clashes that existed in the past was between the Austrian school and the German historical school. Now, again, we can't get totally into what the German historical school view is, but essentially the German historical school on the subject of economics held the view that's usually dubbed historicism. Now, the basic thrust behind historicism is that economics is not composed of a set of unchanging, always present laws, just like physics would have laws that apply everywhere. The Austrians also view economics as having laws that apply everywhere. So like the law of demand, the fact that as price goes up, demand goes down, is going to be valid everywhere. Like you're never going to find an example of a society where that's validated in any way. Whereas the German historical school would disagree. They would say that the laws of economics are dictated by history. So certain economic laws that might be valid in the past might not necessarily be valid today. And vice versa, there might be laws that are valid today that weren't valid in the past. So economics, just like anything else, is something that's like constantly changing. And there was this entire really ideological battle that happened between Karl Menger, who was the founder of the modern Austrian school of economics, and the German historical school. And the term that was given for this is the Methodon Strike, which is a German word sort of like the method war or something like that. So it's this idea of there was these two different ways of viewing economics that were kind of battling back and forth within the ideological halls of Vienna between Karl Menger and the historical school here, of whether or not economics is really just this historical phenomenon where different laws can exist at different times and it's not necessarily set in stone, or whether or not economics has these true laws about human nature that are going to apply everywhere at all times in all places. So another ideological clash here is between sort of the Austrian school and the logical positivists. Now, there's a lot we could talk about logical positivism, but one specific thing that Murphy brings up about the logical positivists is their view on tautologies. Now, if you know a little bit about philosophy, you might know that the way that the logical positivists try to understand the way that tautologies work is that, well, tautologies they're fundamentally empty, is what they claimed. Is that, well, a tautology, everything that's involved in a tautology is already present within the premises. So the conclusion really contains everything that the premises contained. It's just totally empty. So like they would say that, the statement that a bachelor is an unmarried man, well, that's a tautology, right? Like, of course that's true. No one would ever deny that, right? But they would deny the logical positivist meaning. They would deny that content has any meaning, because everything that's implied within an unmarried man is also implied within a bachelor. So we're not really saying anything meaningful at all. And it's not like we're saying anything about the world, right? It's not like a statement of science where we're adding to our knowledge or anything like that. Whenever we're saying that a bachelor is an unmarried man, everyone just nods in agreement. Everybody already knew that. If you knew the definition of a bachelor, you already knew that it was an unmarried man, right? So this just seems definitionally true. It's just meaningless. And the way that Mises responds to this in Human Action, which is a response that I particularly like, is that, well, geometry is a bunch of tautologies as well, right? But the buildings that are built using the laws of Euclidean geometry, they still stand up, right? The bridges that are built using the laws of Euclidean geometry, they don't just fall into the water, right? All these buildings still stand up. So even if you want to say that, okay, everything that was contained in the conclusion was already in the premises, okay, then maybe that's true. I mean, it is true. It's a tautology. But that doesn't mean that's not meaningful in some way. It doesn't mean that it can't be useful to us, right? I mean, just like he says, the buildings that are built with Euclidean geometry, they stand up. The buildings work. Architecture is true, right? So it is telling us something about the world, even if it is a tautology some way. It's still useful to us. We can still gain knowledge from it in some sense. And the last one here is the empiricist, or what might be called not necessarily the logical positivist, but the positivist view of economics. And really the positivist view of economics can really be summarized in a famous essay from Milton Friedman that we can't really get into here. But it's essentially an essay where he tries to defend the application of positivism to economics. So as opposed to the Austrian methodology where we, using praxeology, try to determine the laws of economics through logical deduction, instead we're going to go out into the world and we're going to conduct different experiments. We're going to do our statistics and econometrics to try to find different laws of economics and different truths that we can add to our own knowledge, right? Different things about economics that we didn't know before, right? And specifically, a lot of times what the positivist view is interested in is this imitation of the scientific process, that we have these hypotheses, and okay, well, we have a hypothesis that maybe X causes Y, or maybe Y causes X, or something like that. We're going to go out and we're going to measure that, and we're going to try to confirm the hypothesis, right? And Mises very strongly rejects this as being a valid method for conducting economics. All of the Austrians do, but specifically Mises does. If you read Human Action, virtually the first 200 pages are really just a refutation of this idea, and specifically defense of his own idea of praxeology as well. Because in Mises' view, the laws of economics here, they're not something that we need to go out and test, right? I mean, this is all nonsensical. You don't need to go out, you don't need to test the Pythagorean theorem to know that it's true. Once you understand the Pythagorean theorem, you don't need to go out and start measuring right triangles just to make sure that Pythagoras got it right. Because once you know the Pythagorean theorem, well, you just know that it logically has to be true. Similarly, you don't test that 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? Because once you understand that 2 plus 2 equals 4, it's not something that requires any further testing. You just know it necessarily to be true. It's just a matter of logic. So similarly, Mises views the laws of economics as something that are necessarily true. Once they're deducted from praxeology, there's no measurement that's necessary. The entire application of positivism isn't something that we need to do at all. And furthermore, it's actually something that's very damaging because it can try to convince us that there's these laws of economics or these connections in economics that don't really exist. We can try to fool ourselves into finding things that aren't even real.